And so just as they tell you when you enter a plane, so you know where you're headed to, this is a session on equity assessment tools and measures, or as I like to think about it, how do we know we've actually made a difference? And in hosting you, I'm joined by my new friend through this process, through a Siren facilitated process, Sharon Alexander, who is my co-host for you all today.
Unprecedented foreign policy failures, rising gas prices, and historic inflation, your voice is more than ever before. So
I think Iris, is it? Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to call you out like that. Yeah, so definitely mute yourselves. Although that was fascinating intro to our session today. So I'm joined by Sharon Alexander, and Sharon and I got to know each other through the Siren process, which itself has been an absolutely innovative and interesting engagement where traditional experts, and I put that in quotes because it really deserves to be in quotes because that often leaves a lot of people out, came together with people that know a lot more than most of us about what the experience of racism in health really feels like at all levels of the system. And so hopefully, I believe, and I think Sharon, you would agree, that there's been a lot of growth together. I have definitely learned a lot. And so we'll kick off with Sharon, but before we do that, let me tell you about who's in the room. And next slide. This always happens. I have suddenly stopped being able to move. There we go. All right, so our speakers today are Ms. Nicole Pereira, who is an analyst with the Blue Shield of California. So she's going to kick us off by telling us a little bit about how a health insurance company, a payer organization, has started looking at measuring the impact on equity for new interventions they come up with, especially their new social care interventions. So that is a very focused part of the world, but a very important one because it includes the perspective of groups that have a lot of the money that pays for healthcare. So from there, we'll move to Dr. Nefertiti Hemphill and Mr. Khanan Chaudhry, who come to us from ATW Health Solutions, but both of them have other roles in life. Dr. Hemphill is a researcher, and Mr. Khanan Chaudhry has founded an organization called Manzar Health that looks at a variety of solutions for health of Muslims in the community and taking a very systemic approach. And then to end us off, we will hear from Dr. Tongtan, Bert, Chantarat, and Bert will share with us a little bit about how we might actually identify and measure structural racism by looking at it at a variety of different levels. And he is based in Minnesota at the School of Public Health at the Center for Anti-Racism Research for Health Equity. So there's some great folks with us today, excited to dig right into the specifics. But before we do that, so here, it's me. I'm Minnie Kahlon. I'm in Austin. I'm a founding vice dean for Dell Medical School, which is a new center for academic medicine at the University of Texas at Austin. And I am joined, as I said, by my colleague, Sharon Alexander. And I'm going to go to Sharon in a second, but I wanted to put up our agreements to begin with. You've seen this in some of the other Siren sessions. Maybe to bring it to life, I don't know, Sharon, I'll choose one and you choose one, okay? That is your favorite agreement. So I'm gonna choose agree to disagree, but seek understanding and to not forget that we are here to learn. Sharon, do you wanna choose an agreement to just highlight the screen?
Sure, I'll choose honor the difference between unsafe and uncomfortable.
Gosh, Sharon, this is kind of crazy because if I had to choose two, those would have been the two that I chose. So we really synced up. Awesome. All right. So this is also just a little tip sheet now, which is giving you a sense of the ways to engage. You can Obviously share your comments in chat. I will be looking at chat for questions, and we get to the Q&A section at the end. And then you have other emoji reactions you can use. I'm thinking that if you do raise a hand, I should be able to see it. Hopefully it gets elevated because there's a lot of people, but I will try to just to look for raised hands. And if it's been a while, definitely put it in chat so I can see that you have a question, and yeah, put on some reactions as necessary. So with that, I am going to turn it over to my new friend and colleague, Sharon Alexander, who's going to tell us a little bit about what measuring racism and measuring equity looks like from her lens and her experience. Over to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Minnie. Thank you very much for those kind words. And it's been fun in our meeting one another, and I've learned quite a bit through this process. So thank you. So everybody, just kind of some house cleaning. You'll see me looking to my right, possibly your left, because I have actually two screens, and my camera is on the one screen that's hitting the side of my face. So, but I'm looking straight ahead, and I'm here and listening to everything. I'm what they call a discussant, an expert by experience. That sounds pretty interesting. I certainly do have quite a bit of experience that I've enjoyed sharing. And so I'm going to start by just sharing a bit about myself, which is what I know a good deal about. So greetings, everyone here. Thank you so much for coming. Again, I'm Sharon Alexander, and I remember, or I'm remembering conversations with my mother. Her name was Catherine. She died at the age of 66 of heart failure back in 1989. And during her lifetime, she had over 24 operations, including vascular and heart bypass surgery. My mom spent lots of time in the healthcare space. Around the time I was 35-ish, she had her right leg amputated below the knee. She often told me of her experiences with healthcare workers who treated her poorly in and out of the hospital. She wasn't taken seriously with her healthcare concerns, often grilled with nebulous questions about her problems, or just simply ignored after long waits to receive care. She was on what they call medical assistance, and she wasn't she was a poor person, and did the best that she could, so she was classified in a number of different ways. So she was an African-American woman who believed she was receiving less for care than other ethnic groups. She needed someone to advocate on her behalf much of the time. I remember that's one of the things she shared with me. So I started my professional career on the executive senior management track, where I received perks like executive health, which really meant that I got an annual physical, a pretty thorough physical every year. I received very special treatment. However, as I got older and benefits changed, mergers and acquisitions, I changed jobs. I noticed that I was a victim potentially of unconscious bias. Meaning, once I went to a local hospital in an affluent suburb, which wasn't too far from where I lived, with a breathing problem, and I was in excruciating pain in my lungs. Really, really bad pain. The emergency staff did not take me seriously. I believe because I was an African-American person and a little overweight. At the time, I was prescribed a muscle relaxer, which did nothing for my pain. I don't know why he prescribed that. A few days or a couple days later, I was diagnosed by another doctor at an urban facility with a pulmonary embolism, which required immediate attention. I was fortunate, as I could have died in 2009. so many racially motivated obstacles in my way to good and equitable healthcare. So fast forward to the present. I'm currently 69. I'll be 70 in a couple of weeks in October. These concerns still remain. I can still see what my mother was concerned about. I'm now concerned about those kinds of things as well. So since January 2022, I have participated in numerous focused advisory and other information gathering groups like Patient Advocacy Foundation and Siren, helping researchers appreciate the lived racial experiences of African American people, quantified in these research projects referenced throughout this day and day one, and I'm sure in day 2 to 3. I'm here today to encourage researchers to work hard to apply a racial equity lens to social care research and practice towards an end goal of strengthening the health equity impacts of social care. Please help move these obstacles at this research level. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I didn't know exactly what you were going to say, but I knew you would be the perfect anchor for our next talks. And I think as we move ahead, we will remember the personal experiences, some of which did not change, this feeling of not being heard, the not being taken seriously from your mother to yourself. And then you also touched on the other end of the spectrum, which are structural imbalances. There was a period where things might have felt better because you had the privilege of being part of a more structured benefit structure. And then when that went, back you were to what seems like hadn't changed. So really, thank you for that. And I know we'll reference it as we move ahead. So let's move from here to programs and an approach to measuring equitable impact of programs by, in this case, a healthcare insurer, and this is Blue Shield of California. So let's go to you, Nicole, and tell us a little bit about the systematic approach you all are taking to make sure that as you create interventions, that you're thinking about the kinds of things that Sharon brought up and finding a way to measure that you're doing, as hopefully improving the way we're doing things with respect to these kinds of hurdles that people face. Over to you.
Let me share screen right here and then get this into present mode. Second. Okay. Is everyone able to see the screen okay?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to come to this session. My name is Nicole, and I'll be sharing with you the Health Equity Assessment Tool, otherwise known as HEAT. This is a standardized tool that we've developed to objectively assess health equity impact of health transformation interventions here at Blue Shield of California. And today, I'm really hoping to leave you with actionable information on how this tool could be adapted to improve health equity impacts of social care research. So I'll start with a little background and context of my position and team. I work as an analyst on the evaluation team at Blue Shield of California, and our team sits within the broader health transformation team, which spearheads the transformation of the current healthcare system into a community integrated system. Getting to this community integrated system, we believe involves a focus on more than just healthcare delivery, but rather a comprehensive population health and wellness approach. So on this slide, you'll see a number of projects that we are investing in as part of our transformation efforts. And they encompass a broad range of areas, including ones kind of related to the quadruple aim in healthcare. And usually we focus on piloting multiple interventions at once. The interventions themselves may be a community health intervention, a technology intervention, or another type. And my team, the Health Transformation Data and Evaluation team, is specifically focused on evaluating these interventions and uses qualitative and quantitative data to assess the impact of health transformation interventions on these areas. Now, a core part of sort of getting to the community integrated health system and having this comprehensive population health and wellness focus is embedding health equity in our journey by ensuring that we as an organization understand why some populations have experienced historical and ongoing inequities in treatment, resources, and access to care. One of the ways our team is driving organizational progress towards achieving health equity is by ensuring that the intervention teams that we work with have the tools they need to include health equity principles in their work. One of these tools being the HEAT. The underlying framework of HEAT is grounded in recognizing the historical realities that have led to contemporary health injustices, so that when we talk about addressing racial health equity and develop tools to assess progress towards health equity, we're integrating elements at the macro and the meso level, as you see on this framework right here, into our measures and evaluation tools, as opposed to focusing on sort of the disease and injury aspect, which is where much of the traditional healthcare emphasis lies. So our team developed HEAT in alignment with this framework. The main reasons we developed the tool, as I mentioned, is to address health inequities across and within the California communities that we serve, to measure progress towards building health equity into the design and the implementation and evaluation of health care interventions, and to be able to track the equity impact across time and more broadly throughout the organization. In terms of methodology, when designing this tool, we reviewed other existing tools in the literature. We sought leadership buy-in to further reinforce health equity is an organizational priority before launching HEAT. And we also engaged with an advisory panel that was made up of health practitioners, academics, policy experts. All of these individuals, both the internal and external subject matter experts who participated in designing this tool, sought input from or included direct representation of stakeholders with lived experience of racism, economic challenges, and other inequities. Since this tool was primarily designed for internal purposes, it was imperative that we also work closely with our internal Blue Shield Health Equity team and with the actual intervention teams who would be using this tool to assess their own interventions. In terms of implementation, on the bottom of the slide, you'll see a little more detail on how to and when to implement. The HEAT was designed to be implemented at least twice. So once during what we call the design phase of an intervention, and then another time at least 6 months following implementation or post-baseline implementation. There's an opportunity to implement the tool at further out, like at 6-month intervals, which enables this longitudinal assessment across time. So I'll get into more detail here about the actual components of the tool. So here are the 6 domains that comprise HEAT, and they span areas that include getting rooted, which is really embedding the framework that I shared with you earlier a few slides ago, using data, and assessing the reduction of inequities, as well as engaging just diverse perspectives. Within each domain, there are a series of questions that we score to assess whether or not an intervention team is incorporating health equity principles into the intervention. The intervention then receives scores for each domain, as well as an overall score, and I'll get into that in the subsequent slides. In terms of some questions that could tie to some of these indicators in these respective domains, so let's just take domain 2, for example, which is about using data. A sample question could ask if the intervention team was collecting data on race or ethnicity, or if we're stratifying by race or ethnicity to track who's exposed to the intervention, or how are findings analyzed to reflect the experience of different racial and ethnic subgroups. Other domains, such as domain 5, an example question would be, were individuals with lived experience of discrimination in healthcare settings engaged in the actual solution implementation or even in the evaluation phase? As with any tool, it needs to be adaptable. And I mentioned that this tool is intended to be applied during the design phase and then once during actual implementation. So during the design phase, which can be a baseline, some of these domains may not apply, specifically domain 4 and domain 6. and that focus on more of assessing impact and actual closing of health equity gaps, or aspects related to dissemination, which may not take place until further out from baseline. Getting more into how the scoring works, and what a potential output would look like. This is a sample dashboard of what we would present to our intervention teams. On here, you'll see that we assess how the intervention performed on questions within each domain, and each domain is then assigned a score and then weighted, and then the intervention is given an overall score. The scoring is a collaborative process itself, and it engages the full intervention team. The score is then shared along with a qualitative summary of our findings to help teams understand where they can improve after each domain is assessed. And this is kind of showcased on my next slide here. So here, I've broken out each portion of the dashboard to detail its components. Starting with the top left of the dashboard, which kind of contextualizes the name of the intervention, kind of location that it was taking place in. And then the bottom portion is the actual scoring portion, which captures responses to essentially Likert type questions, or Likert response type questions. And then we average all the domain scores and then weight the averages to create an overall score. The interpretation of the overall score is on a percent scale, and we provide sort of that qualitative assessment piece to add more meaning to that score. So our intervention teams can gauge if health equity principles are absent, emergent, or integrated in the intervention. Because the scoring can be implemented across time, we can look at how did HEAT scores change from 2022 to say 2025 for a specific intervention. And that enables us to ask if the interventions are making progress in incorporating equity principles. In terms of application, so one of the most important things that we try to emphasize with this tool is that although it is an assessment, it's not a pass-fail exam, nor does it satisfy a checkbox. The tool is really meant to be a reflective process, and we try to emphasize that at any stage of the intervention, the HEAT is framed as a collaborative learning tool to advance health equity principles and assess progress towards those principles. Finally, one of the objectives of this conference today is to critically examine how social care research can become a stronger tool for advancing racial health equity. Today, I've shared from an evaluation lens one tool that we've developed that could help examine how racism impacts interventions we invest in from a payer perspective. Beyond this, the HEAT also seeks to examine the intersectionality of race with disparities related to gender and language preference, for example. So I want to leave you with a few recommendations that may be applicable for your work if you were looking to develop a similar tool. Starting with considering the domains and the elements of this tool, you may need to ask if some or all of these domains are reflective of your organization's health equity approach or the intervention's health equity approach. Some domains may need to be added in, some may need to be removed, especially based on the implementation timeline for an intervention. Second, who is the intended audience? We developed HEAT for internal use. A version of this tool could be adapted for audiences that include community members. Speaking of including community members, you may want to integrate their perspectives into the actual design and development of a health equity measurement tool. And this goes beyond developing a measure for internal use to one that has been informed by community perspectives. Finally, there's a lot of momentum and value in measuring health equity today. And when it comes to accountability, every intervention our team evaluates should include an equity focus. And this is just one tool that helps us drive towards this. But tools like this are only meaningful if there's organizational and leadership value for health equity. And it has to really be part of the organizational culture to support teams in using such tools and trying to make progress towards health equity goals. So that's all I have for you all today. And I will.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. Yeah, this is always an interesting one because I don't want to interrupt while you're on your flow. This timekeeping is going to be hard, but that was great because it anchored us in a very specific, concrete approach to measure. And I can already tell you, I don't want the answer yet because we have to go to our next talk, but I can already tell you that one of the key questions is going to be to give us a sense of interventions, perhaps, that to give us a sense of how an intervention, the interventions you've used this on and or how they might score. So think about that before we come to the end.
Sure.
At this point, I think that we are moving ahead. And Bert, if that's all right, are you up for going next? I think we're actually, and that's going to be perfect for our time. But I think it looks like we will not be able to hear from our colleagues at ATW Health Solutions. So we're going to go straight to you. We're going to dive deep into structural racism, sort of like the opposite end of the spectrum almost in some sense. And then we'll get to questions. Are you good to go?
Okay.
Awesome.
This is good. So I can speak a little more. I generally have so many slides, but thank you.
We still have the same amount of time right now. I hate to tell you.
I know,
you
but
stick to your time.
I know.
But
I
we'll get
know,
the
but if you
conversation.
have like 2 people, then why would I speak with them? But anyway, I'm going to try to stick to
All
that.
right. Okay.
And hi, everyone. My name is Bert Chantarat. I am a research scientist at the University of Minnesota within the Center of Anti-Racism Research and Health Equity. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is measuring structural racism, and to kind of like put you in a framework that what we observe as health inequity and distribution of maldistribution of risk factor across different races. It's not just happened, but it's a product of a system that was put in place to create that. And if we don't fix that, then health inequity will just persist that way. So what is structural racism? So you may have seen this definition before. Structural racism is a totality of way in which society fosters racial discrimination through mutually reinforcing inequity system. And that can be many system, housing, education, employment, criminal justice. And together these create the system in which white is put on top and black is not black, like racialized people are generally at the bottom and being exposed to more risk-related health risk, basically. So the figure on the left is, you can think of racism as, racism itself is like an iceberg, in that there's many things that built into this system of structural racism. But the way that we sometimes generally think about it or kind of like operationalize it, we only see interpersonal relationship like racial slur or things like that, or like discrimination within the healthcare industry. But we don't really know or try to dig into what's under the water. And that's what is important to kind of think of it in a larger framework. So let me put this in structural racism in relation to what people in healthcare system or people who have their individual level intervention generally look at. So, on a point. So this is health outcome. So this framework is created based on the fundamental cause of health inequities. So this is health outcomes that we focus on. And these are many factors that affect health. And a lot of people, some of you guys focus on access to healthcare. And different access to healthcare is not just happen. It is a product of a system policy that creates these inequities. For example, you may think of hospital, different quality hospital, and a lot of low quality hospital, sometimes called black hospital, or like hospital in a low income, which is kind of like an indication sometimes as black, which is kind of, that's another form of structural racism. But this system itself is governed by the higher level of what we call structural racism. So if you think about this from a pattern, so a lot of intervention kind of focus on this area, but this factor is actually the distribution of healthcare, for example, is governed by an upstream factor. So if we focus on just addressing healthcare alone for individual level, then you will just fix some good people, but the pattern will persist because you didn't fix the root cause of it. So that's why measuring structural racism or understanding the root cause, fundamental cause of racial health inequity is important. And it is something that we all should think about when designing health inequity intervention. So why do we need to measure structural racism? We can change what we cannot measure. And if you would like to dig a little bit more into what that means, so we have a paper out last year in Health Affairs that kind of details the importance of measuring structural racism and the science, current science related to that. But I'll explain some of the usual or common use measure. So when we think about structural racism, a lot of people think about residential segregation. And I mentioned that a little bit earlier that, for example, racially segregated neighborhood, like for example, what people know as predominantly Black neighborhood, can have limitation in access to various things, lower quality of education, and lower community resource, and sometimes community resources tied to a lot of other funding. So that's why residential segregation is one form of structural racism that drives poor health. And in this map, each colored is basically indication of different grading, that what we call redlining. And in many previous research, in the neighborhood that it's graded as parasitus, and that's, for example, we call it a B grade. Those are neighborhoods that are associated with higher risk for many diseases. For example, in a lot of my work, we focus on birth outcome. You see higher rate of preterm birth in that area compared to in the areas called A grade, which are what the bank think of it as. This is a very profitable area to fund. But from residential segregation, we, as a current literature, we move beyond that one domain of structural racism to look at many forms of structural racism. So this is the definition that I showed you earlier. And based on this definition, you can see that racism infiltrates our society through housing, education, employment, and so on and so forth. So right now, the way we study structural racism is, oh, sorry, let me go back. So measuring structural racism, right now, we look at various dimensions. And from our own center, we have looked at, for example, this is a paper that we look at employment inequities for equally qualified Black and white workers. And this is another study that we look at related to racialized policing. Like in Minnesota, for example, Black neighborhoods are more likely to be surveilled by police, and that's the driving cause of this maldistribution of stressor, I guess, and that cause different risks of preterm birth or low birth rate among different groups that live predominantly in different areas of the city of Minneapolis. So when we primarily when we think of structural racism, I said earlier that we look at many dimensions of it. This is how we generally look at it. We generally look at education. For example, education inequity creates health inequity, or neighborhood inequity creates health inequity. We look at things as a disjoint domains. That is not, which is not the way structural racism is. Structural racism is a system of inequity that work together, entangling, and all together create health inequity, cause health inequity between white and racialized group. So the way in which we are moving forward with measuring structural racism is, how do we measure the system as a system, and use that to understand the association between structural racism and health inequities. So this, I don't know this too nitty-gritty, but studying structural racism in the system is a little bit difficult, because like based on when we study, when we use regression to study like highly correlated factors, for example, different dimensions of structural racism, you will generally, if you put all this factor into a regression model, you will not get a correct estimate because of the violating a lot of assumption. So the work that I'm moving forward right now in our area is to how do we operationalize structural racism as a system and measure it as such. So one way that we generally do that, and if you have we're trained in psychology, you may have heard of a latent construct approach. And latent construct approach is used a lot by, for example, psychologists who study personality. And so one of the example would be for someone like me who used to be in a job market for like a faculty position, I would generally describe myself as quiet, diligent, hardworking. So what is that? Which dimension is the one that responsible for me getting a job right now? So you would say all of them. So that's a representation, that's a multi-dimensional latent construct that we use analogous to how we measure structural racism. So structural racism is a latent construct, multi-dimensional latent construct. And the approach we use to measure that is called latent class analysis. So this picture shows the way we measure it at the moment. We look at 6 dimensions of structural racism and kind of tie them together into what we call typology or patterns. And we use pattern to predict. So we use that pattern to predict health inequity in Minnesota, birth inequity in Minnesota. And for those of you who think Minnesota is a very healthy state, it is a healthy state, but you have to look at who's healthy. And we have a history of racial disparity persisting over time in both and other countries. So I showed you this earlier. So we create this pattern measure of structural racism. And we use that approach to identify various neighborhoods in the state of Minnesota, looking at all of these factors together. I'm not going to go into detail about what we find, but think of it as we find 3 patterns across the state of Minnesota, and the intricate relationship between various dimensions create health inequity differently. So this is one example of our finding. So if you look at, so this figure shows 2 things. So if you look at type A, and type A is one pattern, you will see that the red one is white, and green is US1 black, and yellow is foreign born black. You see that the risk for white is always like lower compared to the other 2 groups. And these are the same for all races, for all racial groups. The other question that we can answer is,
sorry, we're at time.
Okay, so
yeah, this is so interesting. This is like getting right. It's almost like the you want to know what next, like what's the answer?
no, I guess I can skip to let me just tell you what we're doing. So I guess the core message that you can take away is to understand and eliminate racial health inequity. You can't just focus on individual level, because that's just like, that is important, but to eliminate racial health inequity, it is also to think about where the inequity comes from and addressing that. So that's mean looking at the system that creates racial health inequity, and that's structural racism. Anyway, that's all. I'm funded by Europe, Minnesota Population Center, and also the Population Center.
No, thank you so much, Bert. And even though we didn't get to maybe the hard conclusion, but you're showing how you identify, measure, and then you use that across the state or in particular areas like in birth disparities, you're able to start seeing trends like we're used to doing in so many other settings. So basically, you're giving us a new tool set to really identify what the elements are that drive structural racism and then look at how they express themselves. So that was fascinating. We are definitely on time challenged, but the good news is that we do have, I think, our friends, Dr. Hemphill and Mr. Chaudhry here. Now we will not, at this point, I don't think we have time for a talk. It's 7 minutes to 2 on my watch, but even if you could share just in a few minutes, just the big point that you're going to be making, which is around the importance of looking at policies and why understanding the impact of policy is critical to understand and measure health equity. I think that was the heart of what you were going to share. And I'd love perhaps if you just speak to it, and it might even be more compelling for our group, and we could take it from there.
Absolutely. So good afternoon, everyone. So we, both myself, Nefertiti, OjiNjideka, Hemphill, and Khanan, Chaudhry, we worked together at ATW Health Solutions. And we had this awesome opportunity to work with the Office of Minority Health, Health and Human Services around the development of a policy assessment tool, specifically a model that focuses on the impact of policy on mental health among Black youth. So, the relationship between policy and public health is very often ignored and is really not well studied at all. And so when you take a step back and you think about the role that policy plays in our society and how that impacts public health, it's really a major issue for concern and a blind spot in the way that we approach the type of health equity work that we do. So, we set out to try to look at the available models that were already in play. So there are some frameworks that have been established by the CDC. There are other policy groups that have put together models. So there's a CDC Health in All Policies model, there's a policy cycle hourglass model, and the CDC policy process cycle. And all of these foundational frameworks really focus on the evaluation of policy. And there's a pretty big difference between evaluating a policy and assessing a policy. So in evaluation, you're really looking at whether or not the policy does what it's designed to do. So in the case of, for example, a red light traffic law, right? Does that policy reduce the number of accidents in a neighborhood area? Versus policy assessment, where you're really taking a step back to look at whether or not that red light traffic law impacts a specific health outcome, such as mental health in a neighborhood area. So, taking a high level view and thinking about whether or not we could take what am I trying to say? Whether or not we can kind of take an initial step to think about not doing harm to communities as we are generating and developing policies, be they government, so federal, state, local level, be them organizational, administrative level policies, all of these different things impact communities. And so what we wanted to do is say, all right, we don't want to just look at whether or not the policy is doing what it was designed to do from an evaluation perspective, but let's look at whether or not this policy is having a negative or a positive impact on communities, and how can we engage or reform that policy to be able to improve those conditions. So that's really what we did, kind of in a nutshell. It's really awesome work. I'll pause here and let Brother Khanan weigh in.
Thank you, Dr. Hemphill. So really, evaluation is important, but assessment is what's needed to consider the human impact of enacting a policy. It's the intended, unintended, and crossover effects of policies that are not currently being measured, and the need to be captured to attenuate potential harms through social care. This means that policy assessment is essential to dismantling and understanding the social and structural determinants of health that contribute to health disparities. So then we'll go ahead and jump right into the model that proposes this idea. Back at you, Dr. Hemphill.
So really quickly, the model that we developed in conjunction, right, with the United States Department of Health and Human Services, also Office of Minority Health, this policy assessment framework model really focuses on addressing the impact of policy and promoting behavioral health among Black youth. So it was developed in response to the mental health crisis presented before Congress and the Ring the Alarm report that was published about the mental health crisis in Black youth. And so what our model incorporates is a strategic application of a health equity lens, mental health in all policy, stakeholder engagement and awareness, and it consists of 4 phases: policy identification, policy assessment, strategic reform and implementation, and policy evaluation. And then quickly, we took a step further and developed a policy assessment tool to accompany the policy assessment framework. And this allows us to actionize those steps in the policy process cycle. So those steps look like, beginning with policy identification and identifying the relevant policy, and then moving on to phase 2, which is policy assessment. And what we did is divide policy assessment into 3 primary areas. They consist of appraisal, scoring, right? So using health equity indicators to generate a Likert scale to be able to gauge the performance of a policy, especially in the context of promoting Black youth mental health. And then that last step is feasibility. So once you've been able to appraise the policy and see what its performance is within a community, taking a step back and determining whether or not reform is feasible or whether or not you need to go back to the drawing board. And then for phase 3 is that strategic reform and implementation phase. So developing an implementation plan that allows for the revision of that policy in a meaningful and impactful way. So just, quickly, in conclusion, right, the main points that we really were hoping that you could take away from what we were going to share today, or what we're sharing today, is that policy assessment process can be used to examine the impact of policies on marginalized communities and those hardest hit by health disparities, and that researchers play an important role in policy assessment by generating evidence to understand policy's impact. And then lastly, partnering with marginalized communities and communities of color is really an essential component to the effective policy assessment and research process. So those are the take-home points. Thank you so much, Minnie, for letting us pop in here.
Oh no, you all, this was amazing. And I have to agree with Yuri. This is I know unfortunately you had to miss the first 2, but this really worked well with the other 2 talks. And we are almost at time. I have like a minute here. And so I actually thought Sharon, if you're up for it, I'd love to give you the last word. We started with Sharon's story and something very concrete to hold on to. You've heard about 3 different sort of approaches to measure equity in our work. Maybe you want to just highlight, one thing you're taking away or one thing you want to tell us, given what you've heard. What should we be thinking about as we leave this room? Oh, you're on mute.
So thank you very much, Minnie. Hey guys, I didn't know I was going to do this, so this is a bit of a surprise. So, but we'll handle it well. Absolutely, some amazing stuff, you guys. Someone made a comment. Wonderful lightning presentation, guys. Absolutely, Dr. Hemphill, you guys made it that way. But I guess what I was feeling and experiencing as I was listening to all of the wonderful data that was being provided is the thoughtfulness that was going into the different tools that were available, and the tools that we absolutely need, and the tweaking that's necessary in order for us to achieve the end goals. And in a very thoughtful and in-depth, I think, approach to ferreting out or highlighting those pieces that are significantly important, those pieces that have been used or have been identified as important or as something that we should be looking at to help us to get where we need to go, and whether or not they really are getting us or taking us where we need to go. And offering or indicating that we need to have that kind of flexibility to be able to make things happen for ourselves, to be able to make sure that we do it justice, to make sure that we really are able to identify. I mean, I know we want to identify all of the groups. We want to include all of the groups. But I'm going to say to you very selfishly, because I can, as the discussant, that there isn't enough focus on the African-American experience. In my experience in these 69, almost 70 years that I've been on this planet, that often our concerns and our issues are diluted by some other related issue, and that we are often not really highlighted in the way that I believe that we could be highlighted. I think the world would be a better place if we did that. I really do think that the world would be a better place, and social equity, health, racial equity will be achieved. That's all I have to say.
Wow, what better note to leave this conference on? And you're absolutely right. We need to put a deliberate focus on certain things, and race, and specifically the African-American experience, is a major part of the history and the ugly history of this country. And the only way we move ahead is by embracing it specifically and deliberately. And I think today we learned about 3 different ways to do that. So with that, I think we will close this session. Oh, there's the last few minutes of mindfulness are happening. Join the lobby, and see you in some other intellectual, thought-provoking, action-oriented space. Bye.